Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take stacks of research, articles, you name it, and try to boil it down for you, the key insights. Maybe some surprising bits, too.
Hopefully keep you hooked.
Exactly. So today, we're taking a bit of a journey, not just through a place, but actually through its DNA. Think about a spot on the map that's like a living genetic crossroads, a canvas, really, painted over thousands of years by people moving around.
And that place is Morocco.
Morocco, yeah. It's where these ancient bloodlines, all sorts of migrations, even influences you might not expect, they all come together. They shape the culture, sure, but also the very genes of the people. So the big question for us today is, what exactly makes Morocco's genetic story so unique? That's what we're digging into.
It's a great question. And Morocco is, it's genuinely one of the most fascinating genetic mosaics you can find anywhere. A lot of that comes down to its geography. It's right there, slap bang at the junction of Africa and Europe.
The ultimate crossroads.
Totally. A bridge between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
And this location isn't just like convenient trivia. It means Morocco's DNA holds this incredibly rich, complicated story. Migration, survival, people mixing, stretching back well over 10,000 years. So calling it a genetic time capsule, it actually fits pretty well. It captures so much human history.
Okay, let's unpack that time capsule then. If we're thinking like genetic archaeologists digging down, what's the very first layer, the foundation? What's that really prominent genetic signature we hit right away?
Right at the base, yeah. You find the E1B1B haplogroup.
E1B1B, okay.
It's widely known as the Berber gene.
Yeah.
And its presence is, well, it's pretty striking. Studies consistently find that in some parts of Morocco, up to maybe even over 80% of men carry this specific marker.
80%? Wow, that seems incredibly high. What does that tell us? What's the story behind that number?
It tells us something really fundamental. This E1B1B marker, its origins go way back. We're talking North African populations from over 12,000 years ago.
12,000 years, so way before.
Way before the Arab conquest, yeah. And even before major European influence really kicked in. So this marker, it suggests that Berber identity isn't just, cultural preference. It's biologically deeply rooted in the region's ancient past.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that even in areas that became heavily Arabized culturally, people speak Arabic, identify as Arab, the underlying gene pool, genetically speaking, often stays predominantly Berber. It kind of challenges this idea that, a cultural shift just wipes out the
biological history underneath. It's more like layers being added, culture layered on top of this deep genetic foundation. That really makes you think about belonging, doesn't it?
It really does. That distinct, the cultural layer versus...
autosomal DNA. Remind us quickly.
Right, so instead of just the Y chromosome from dad or mitochondrial DNA from mom, autosomal looks at the whole mix. All the genes you get from all your recent ancestors, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. Gives you that broader view. And there was this big study, actually, 2017, in Nature Communications. It used exactly this kind of analysis and confirmed just how complex Morocco's mixed ancestry really is.
Okay, so what did that study find? What specific threads make up
this tapestry you mentioned?
It pinpointed a really specific blend. You've got the Maghrabi component, that's basically the indigenous Berber DNA we talked about, but also significant chunks from European Neolithic.
And they found some cool specifics, like some Moroccans carry DNA linked to ancient farmers from Iberia, Spain and Portugal from thousands of years ago, while others show markers common in the Levant, think modern-day Lebanon, Syria.
Yeah.
It's this dynamic mix from all directions over a really long time.
Wow. So Maghrebi, European, Sub-Saharan, Near Eastern, it's like a genetic fingerprint touched by so many different groups over millennia. What drove this? What were the big historical movements, the forces that etched these patterns into the DNA?
Well, this genetic mix is basically a direct echo of thousands of years of history. Intense interactions, big migrations. You can pretty much map the genetics onto known history. Think
And didn't you mention Sub-Saharan Africa?
Absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
You can't forget the trans-Saharan trade routes. For centuries, people, goods, and yes, genes moved across the desert from deeper in Africa. That had a profound impact. Each wave added another layer.
And this isn't just dusty old history, is it? I mean, this
Yeah.
genetic stuff, it has real impact today, especially around identity. You hear about this sometimes, the debate within Morocco, maybe tensions around Berber versus Arab identity. How does the genetics play into that conversation now?
Yeah, this is where science bumps right up against modern life and sometimes challenges narratives. Genetically, the studies strongly suggest that many, probably most, Moroccans who identify as Arab today are actually, genetically speaking, more Berber than anything else.
Really, more Berber.
Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean there's no Arab ancestry, but often it seems to be a layer added onto that much older indigenous base. So it points towards what historians call cultural Arabization, people adopting the language, the culture, the identity, rather than a wholesale biological replacement of the original population.
Okay, so a cultural shift more than a genetic one in many cases.
Exactly. And that finding, as you can imagine, it really fuels discussions about national identity, about language rights, about what Arabness even means in North Africa. It asks some tough questions about who belongs and how we define that.
So the genetics is kind of flipping the script on some traditional ideas, suggesting Arab in Morocco is often more about culture than deep ancestry.
That's a fair summary, yeah. It's nuanced, but important. And you actually see some Moroccan Amazigh, that's the Berber people's own name for themselves, activists using these genetic findings.
How so?
They use it to argue for reclaiming that indigenous identity. They see the science as backing up their claim to be the foundational people of the region, sometimes pushing back against narratives they feel have sidelined their history. It becomes, scientific evidence in a cultural debate.
And there's that other layer, too, the one you mentioned that's often overlooked, the Sub-Saharan connection. You said it's part of the mix, but how significant is it? What does the data show there?
It's definitely significant. The data consistently shows that around, say, 15% or so of Moroccan DNA, depending on the specific population group, carries clear Sub-Saharan African ancestry. This isn't trivial, it's not recent. It points to a deep historical connection.
And where does that connection come from? What's the history behind that specific thread?
It's mainly a legacy of those centuries-long trans-Saharan trade routes we mentioned, caravans going back and forth. But also, and this is crucial and often difficult, a significant part is linked to the trans-Saharan slave trade. This brought many people from south of the Sahara into North Africa over centuries.
That's a history that's not always talked about openly, is it?
Exactly. It's often been a somewhat silenced history in the national story, but genetics doesn't really allow for silence, does it? It brings it back to the surface. And the social reality today is that many black Moroccans, even though their families have been in Morocco for centuries, can still face social exclusion or discrimination. So this genetic data becomes incredibly powerful. It's scientific proof reinforcing their deep roots, their indigenous claim to being Moroccan. It challenges simplistic ideas about who is originally Moroccan. It's a scientific truth with very real social weight.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, Berber Foundation, European farmers, Near Eastern traces, Arab cultural and genetic input, the deep Sub-Saharan connection, what's the big takeaway? What does Morocco's DNA ultimately tell us about identity, history, how people move and mix?
It tells this incredibly layered story, right? It's a narrative of ancient continuity, that Berber core sticking around for millennia. Then, cultural layering, the huge impact of Arab and Islamic culture, transforming society but not erasing the genetics underneath. It definitely shows migration and integration on a grand scale influences from across Africa, Europe, the Middle East. Humans have always moved and mixed. And importantly, it brings those silenced histories back into the light. Slavery, racial identity complexities, things nations sometimes prefer not to examine too closely. And finally, it poses these really relevant modern questions, not just for Morocco, but for all of us. Who belongs? What does indigenous even mean after millennia of movement? How should we define ourselves? Culture, language, genes.
That brings us to a really interesting point for you listening right now. If we zoom out from Morocco, this raises a question for you to think about. Does finding out the genetic truth challenge the stories nations tell about themselves? Or maybe it reinforces them in surprising ways. And maybe the bigger question, should national identity be based more on shared culture and language? Or does genetics have a role to play?
Think about that. They're not easy questions, are they? And Morocco's story, etched in its DNA, gives us this really potent case study for thinking about them. It pushes us to look beyond simple labels.
Absolutely. Because Morocco, as we've heard, it really is more than just a country. It's like a living genetic time capsule, full of human history, just waiting for us to understand it better. We hope this deep dive gave you a fresh perspective on identity, history, and this amazing complex thing we call human genetics.